Thank you, Chuck and JP Forum. It is a singular honor to walk down the street, past the baristas that keep me going, past the shops that keep all of us going, seeing so many neighbors along the way, and just put my backpack on the floor and get to talk to my friends and neighbors. I've been half joking that of all of the presentations I've been really fortunate to do in association with the book, that this is the one I'm going to be most nervous about. Because these are the folks I get to see tomorrow morning. And they're either going to look me in the eye or walk right by me. So there are a lot of thanks, and let me just start with one or two, and I want to come back to those at the end as well. I'm here as the sole author on a book. I'm here as the director of an institute, but I stand on the shoulders of a lot of great teams in terms of working out the ideas, in terms of the incredible research that was done that I get to draw on and that I help to mentor and direct as well. And there literally could be dozens of people standing with me today. And if I could embarrass just one person, who I know is in the audience and is also a fellow JPer, Dr. Hannah Thomas. Hannah had the challenge of directing the project that we call Leveraging Mobility, and her singular challenge was to find the nearly 200 families that we had first interviewed in 1998. And like the idiot researcher I am, I hadn't done any maintenance of the sample, that is, trying every year figure out where folks are, and just said, Hannah, here's your project. And she took it on in a stellar way, where we ended up re-interviewing about 85% of the original set of families, which was just incredible. So thanks to Hannah and the whole team. I want to talk tonight about two families that we had the honor of talking to over a 12-year stretch of time. And I want to condense it to their children. And I want to tell you two stories that I think are going to illustrate for me what is the real nub and nexus of what I'm calling toxic inequality. We first met both Peter Ackerman and Tina Medina when they were 5 years old. Actually, we didn't meet them. We talked to their parents. We talked to their parents in 1998. Both of those families happened to then and still reside in the St. Louis area. Peter Ackerman is white. His parents are white. They live in one of the South counties of St. Louis. Peter Ackerman went to college at the University of Missouri-Columbia, and I have every reason to believe that Peter Ackerman has a college degree. Tina Medina is African American. Her family is African American. She grew up in an area of St. Louis called Spanish Lake, which is like a stone's throw away from where the Lewis and Clark expedition launched out of St. Louis many, many years ago. Tina didn't finish high school. Last we knew of Tina, she was working as a receptionist at a local hotel in the St. Louis area. And this is a story that gets narrated with a lot of cultural baggage. The typical narration of this story is, Tina Medina, poor soul, grew up in an African-American family whose parents probably didn't care that much about higher education or transmit those values, and she may not have worked hard enough in school to have gotten there. Whereas Peter Ackerman grew up in a family that valued higher education. I think you know these stories. And usually the language is a lot harsher than I'm narrating it at the moment. But that Peter Ackerman is a success and went to college and graduated, where Tina Medina didn't. And that's partially the story of America. Well, here's a different, more factually based understanding of where Tina Medina and Peter Ackerman are. Both sets of parents had some college, but without college degrees. Both sets of parents, I would argue, worked at jobs that had about the same level of functioning. Peter's parents worked in public safety, not on the officer side, but on the dispatching side, if you will. His mother worked in human resources, the kinds of positions that you didn't need then in 1998 a college degree for. Tina Medina's parents, as I said, I would argue, worked at pretty similarly functioning positions. Her father, Elijah Medina, actually had 2 jobs and a side business of restoring antique cars, which was a side business of his. And his mother also worked as a bookkeeper, essentially. The salaries that they got paid, two-parent working households in both instances. Peter Ackerman's parents actually earned, when we first interviewed them and talked to them, about $20,000 more a year. And by the time we re-interviewed and talked to them again in 2012, their aggregate salaries had risen by about $30,000 or $40,000. Peter Ackerman's father, David, had sustained a job loss in 2010 as a result of the recession, was unemployed for a few months, but came back to work at a job that paid him a lot less. One of the casualties of the recession. Tina Medina's parents worked at a series of jobs, moving around, essentially doing the same kind of work that they had been doing over the period of 12 years. But here's where some of the difference starts to creep into the story that I think is really what really needs to be lifted up. Peter Ackerman's parents worked at a large organization that offered a very robust set of what Hannah has termed for us employment capital, or benefits. Benefits including not just paid sick leave, but benefits including that large organization paying a large amount of the family's health care. And something that has become, another benefit that has become much less ordinary in American society, especially over the last 2 and 3 decades. They had a savings retirement plan at that large organization that was not voluntary but was mandatory. Peter's parents, who at that point both worked for the same organization, had no choice. They had to put in a certain percent of their paycheck. And the organization they worked for every dollar they were mandated to put in, that organization put in $1.70. So they worked there a long period of time. That starts to build up. Now, some people might, American Affordable Care Act, the word mandate has become a pejorative, but it's exactly the kind of system where the Ackermans were defaulted in, could not leave, right? But became by far the largest source of how they accumulated financial wealth. So that by the time we talked to them in 2012, the family financial wealth was worth over $350,000. Not because of their character, of their ability to take risk, of their ability to defer gratification. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the institutional mechanism of working for a large organization that mandated they do that. It's what we often refer to as an institutional mechanism of savings. One other important benefit with their job. The organization they worked for said basically that if they continued to work there for a period of time, their children's college education or higher education, that tuition would be paid for. Wouldn't we all like to work for that kind of organization or something like it? All right. Peter goes to college. There is no gap between the aspirations of a 5-year-old and his family when we first talked to them and the wherewithal of being able to pay for that college education. Now, clearly he worked and got himself into the University of Missouri at Columbia, to pretty good school and all of that. Tina Medina, her parents worked just as hard, had more jobs, worked more hours per week, had 2 and 3 jobs, didn't get paid quite as much, and did not work for the kind of organizations that offered the kind of benefits that the Ackerman family had access to. Virtually none of their jobs, there was one, but it's relatively minor. Nearly almost none of the jobs they had paid or helped them with retirement savings, and certainly none of them talked about supporting the higher education of their children. So for Tina Medina, the gap between the aspiration of a 5-year-old and her family and higher education, there was a huge financial gap that stood in the way. She left high school. That's a very different way of thinking about and narrating how it is that one African American 5-year-old doesn't get to college, actually doesn't finish high school, and the white 5-year-old child does. And it's a very different way of beginning to understand some of the dynamics that are involved here. And I want to fold in a couple, I want to map onto that some very deeply racialized dynamics. It's not an accident or a random occurrence that the Ackerman family worked at an organization that offered those kinds of benefits, and the Medina family did not. In fact, whites work for employers, about 62% of white workers work for employers that offer some kind of retirement benefits, usually not mandatory, usually not matched. But that's in contrast to 54% of African American workers and only 38% of Latino workers. There's a deep structure, a deeply racialized structure that maps on the ability of families to secure their own future and to be able to take risks along the way. Now, importantly, not just the organizations that Peter Ackerman's parents worked for, but you and I and the state publicly invested in both the college education of Peter Ackerman, the health care of Peter Ackerman, and the retirement security of his parents, due to the taxes or the tax expenditures that the Ackerman family didn't have to pay, because those things are written, etched into stone into our contemporary tax code in the United States. And I'm going to get back to a couple of pieces of data about that relatively soon. But back to the Ackermans and Medinas. I said that the family incomes actually were a bit different, and that difference certainly magnified over the 12 years when we first interviewed them, and then the second time that we interviewed them in 2012 or so. But just looking at the income and the paycheck hides a lot of the story that I think is really important for us to understand, especially where we are in the United States today. When I totaled and tallied the dollar value of the benefits, the employment capital that Peter Ackerman's family had, this is what we come up with. The organization they worked for contributed, in the last year we looked at them, a little over $5,000 to their higher education, not shown up in the paycheck. The organization they worked for contributed $5,500 to their health care. We don't see that in the paycheck. And really significantly, we saw the gasp about higher education. The tuition amounted to about $20,000. Altogether, it was about $30,500 that does not show up in the paycheck of families that are really fortunate, and I would suggest we wished all families had that kind of employment and those kinds of opportunities and those kinds of rewards from their hard work. But the Ackermans had it, and Peter Ackerman was clearly a boost to Peter's aspirations and his ability to carry that out, in contrast to Tina Medina and her family, arguably working just as hard, if not harder. I also want to layer in a little bit about the communities that they lived in. Again, the 12-year period between the first and second interviews, we had this, if I can be a little snarky sociologist here, an intervening field experiment of the Great Recession and housing implosion. So both families were homeowners when we first talked to them in 1998. Again, the Medina family within the city limits of St. Louis, near the river, sort of on the east side of town, area called Spanish Lake. Their community was, as they described it to Hannah and the team and I, pretty diverse. They liked the community, because they were a lot of homeowners mixed with professionals, and they liked the neighborhood. They loved the community. It's why they bought there. They could afford it as well. Their community was devastated by both the Great Recession and the housing implosion. In fact, when we last checked the value of their home, it was still less than what they had bought it for. A story that reverberates in many communities across the country, not just Spanish Lake. The Ackermans is a slightly different story. The value of their home also plummeted in the 2007 to 2009 period, but also regained its value. So that what the equity in their home was actually above water. It was more than what they had bought it for. Right? The Ackermans' home is in a relatively homogeneous white middle-class community. The Medina's home, again, is in Spanish Lake, and as the recession and housing implosion hit their community and began to strip wealth out of it, the community began to change from single-family homeowners to the agents that bought the foreclosed properties, turned around and rented them back. It was changing from a community of homeowners to a community of renters, where some of those renters were federally subsidized through various federal housing programs. And it wasn't just individual buyers that bought those foreclosed properties. They were some of the largest companies that, how do they term this? Oh, they term this so wonderfully in their literature. They buy distressed assets. Okay. I don't think we need to decode that very, very much here. They buy distressed assets, and they're organizations like the Blackstone Group, that is the largest homeowner in the United States today, across the country. And what they do is they buy distressed properties, turn around, rent them. That's the present scheme. And hopefully when those housing markets build back up, they then dispose and sell those properties at an enormous profit. It's a financial investment firm. A firm similar to like that was buying the properties in the Spanish Lake area in St. Louis. Right. Two very different kinds of dynamics going on. All of that melds into why I titled the book Toxic Inequality. And I want to go over that just very briefly, because it's really important for me to carry on the work and try and get across a different kind of understanding of where we are in the United States. Because I think if we understand it differently, what we have to do as a way out of toxic inequality means something different for the kind of work that we do. Now, I like to joke with audiences at this point and ask the microphones to be turned off and the cell phone recordings to be turned off, because I'm about to say something I do not want to be quoted on. Inequality has always been with us and always will be with us. Inequality is not the issue. All right, you can turn the mics back on. The issue is the threshold, the levels, the implication, the racialized basis of the inequality in the United States today that has been building up since the early 1970s. It's not something that occurred with the Great Recession in 2007. That speeded it up and accelerated it for sure. But it's a set of dynamics and processes that have been ongoing in American society at least since the beginning of the 1970s. For me, it has, see if I can remember them all, 6 components. And Chuck, thank you, mentioned one of them, so I can skip over a couple of them pretty quickly here. First, we are at historic highs of both income and wealth inequality in the United States that take us back at least to the beginning of the Great Depression in the late 1920s. And that's as far back as we can really take the data about wealth. So we're really not sure about periods before that. But we're talking about a long stretch of American history where particularly between the period at the end of World War II up until the end of the 1960s, both income and wealth inequality were lessening in the United States as the economy was prospering. All right, so that's number one. Number two, again, I would suggest the sociological data tells this story. Since the early 1970s, Economic mobility, the ability to do better economically over the course of our lifetime, the ability to do better than our parents economically, that sort of economic mobility has stagnated for most American families. Most American families are staying in place, and I'll tell you in a second how we actually are working a lot harder just to try and stay in place. So that sense of economic mobility has, the experience of it, the reality has changed. Associated with that, our living standard for most American families also has stagnated or stalled. That's a very different era. And think about the two forces at play here. Widening inequality at exactly the moment where the ability to do better for yourself, your family, and your community, and your children has stalled. Those are two, I would suggest, pretty combustible mixtures here that for me go into a good part of the makeup of toxic inequality and starts to lead us to a different kind of understanding about where we are in the United States today. One quick data point on how American families marvelously try to navigate this. Comparing the total number of hours worked in a family from 1970 to 2013, American families worked 11% more paid working hours. Now somebody, you calculate that, that's like weeks more a year that we work just to try and stay in the same place. Right. So the notion that, maybe in question and answer, I'm sure we'll get into the politics of this last election and where we are. The pain groups feel about feeling they're working really hard but going nowhere. Now, where they displace the blame is what we need to talk about and their lack of understanding of it. But the fact is, I would suggest, American families really are working harder. The paid working hours have gone up that 11% over this exact same time period that we're talking about. All right. Meld into that changing demographics. And as has become much more apparent in the last election cycle as well, the demographers tell us that sometime in the year about 2042, and I think they're saying November 3rd at 11:04 a.m. To be exact, no one group will be a numerical majority in the United States. And so we see those things happening, and maybe we get to see why, where the great displacement, why it has some resilient soil here. And lastly, not lastly, it's a part that really weaves itself throughout all of this. We have had for a long time pandering to economic and racial anxieties and fear of immigration. And especially during this last election cycle and now continuing, that sense of pandering on the part of politicians, pundits, columnists, unfortunately the large parts of the media as well, has really turned the soil from all the other ingredients that has allowed too many people, in my estimation, in the United States, to think about their own way of understanding where we are and to blame it in a much more fertile sense that resonates with their own experience they're told on people that don't look like them, people that are, quote, foreign, undocumented, alien to the United States. And whether they mean people coming from other countries or whether they mean African Americans or Latinos, it all gets melded together in a lot of very important ways there. So I want to return to the Medinas and the Ackermans. Another part of that story, and it's a really important one for my sense of why I use the title Toxic Inequality. If we understand that story, it tells us about two stories of mobility in American society that is coded by race and is affected by the deeply racialized structures and institutions, some of which I was able to touch on very briefly, and hopefully when we open it up we can go into much more depth about that. Inheritance is one of those factors. Now, it wasn't the case with the Ackerman parents. As I sort of recall it, and I'm going to look at Hannah, who checks me on the real data all the time, I think they bought their first home mostly on their own accord. But I think it could clearly be the case now with their financial assets over $350,000. When the time comes for Peter to start a young family, young Peter Ackerman may get help with the down payment on his first home. At least the family has the wherewithal, the financial ability to do that. Tina Medina's family does not. And that sense of inheritance and financial legacy goes very deep and very far back in our history in American society. In data we've looked at, and I go over a little bit in the book, but it actually comes from other work at the Institute that we've done over a period of time. In looking at not the nearly 200 families that we interviewed and talked to over a period of 12 years, but looking at a random sample of American families going back from 1984 to 2013, the level of inheritance, the difference looks like this. Most American families don't inherit much. And that's the reality. In fact, in the data, we were looking at American families that inherited $10,000 or more. 35% of the families over this period of time, 1984 to 2013, had inherited $10,000 or more. 35%, a little over a third. Okay. Again, I hope all of us here are fortunate enough to be in that third and be able to pass things that we think are important along to our children or other folks in our network. But let's also look at the difference in terms of race here. 44% of American families inherited over $10,000, looking at the same data. And among African American families, it was about 10%. All right, so right away, 44 versus 10, about a 4.5-fold difference as a legacy from one generation to another. That let's sort of call it for what it is, in a sense. It's financial resources that were not earned by the individual that got them. They were fortunate enough in terms of the birth lottery, if you will, to be part of those families and to be part of families that cared about them enough, for sure, that helped pass those financial assets along. Right. But it's not just the money that's passed along. And I hope you've been doing some sub-reading of what I've been talking about. The money and the resources are important. It's what it allows folks to do. It's the risks they can take because there's a backup. It's the home ownership that they can walk into. It's the higher education that they can walk into and not have a $60,000 debt at the end of that degree. But the first paycheck is totally theirs. And they don't have to pay off somebody for the next several decades. Right? It's potential for business development. It's the kinds of things that really are the stuff, if you will, of the cultural part of the American dream. And why it is so much easier for white families to pass along status that they have earned in one generation to the next because of the accumulation of financial wealth. And why the sociological data tells us that when African American families achieve middle class status by virtue of either their income or their occupation, it is much more difficult to pass that along to their children. And I think the primary reason for that is the lack of financial resources in the same African American family that has achieved the same thing, but those wealth resources have not built up in quite the same way. All right, so toxic inequality, a lot of different stories there. I hope I've told you two stories, and obviously I've chosen them for this particular audience because I think it begins to narrate for me some of the deep institutional and deeply racialized themes involved. Maybe some of which are reflected in our own community in a lot of ways and could be part of the conversation today. So let me wrap this up and open it up by spreading a few more thanks around, especially to Chuck and Josh and the folks at the church who have opened up their doors for us tonight and made this wonderful forum available to us. A huge shout out. I've known Chuck for quite a while. I think there's a mutual admiration society going on here. We like to lift each other's work up because I am such a great fan of his work and how it needs to have an even wider audience. And also my folks in the back in the corner, paper cuts. Our local independent bookstore that is handling sales tonight. They're tucked just off on Center Street as you just turn into Green Street. You will find them. They don't have a huge sign on Center Street. They're not allowed to, but they are a center of our community. They provide a lot of different forums for folks to talk in, and for those of us that believe that the written word still has some sway in the ideas and how we develop as a community, I heartily recommend them. And then just finally to my own, Jamaica Plain is my family, my chosen family. Ruth and Isaac and other parts of our network are here tonight, which is a part of the reason I thought I would be more nervous than I actually am. So thank you very much. I think that we want to open it up for questions and conversation. And before I open it up, I would like to invite a conversation about, all right, Tom, you've done the usual academic professorial thing. You've told us how bad things are. What are the ways out of this? I would just suggest the last chapter is chock full of ways out of this. And that's part of the conversation I would really love us to have. And lastly, in the spirit of Jamaica Plain and our community, I'm not the one with the answers. It's everybody in this room acting together in different ways that will be providing the answers. I could be the most brilliant mind ever, but end up talking in a corner to nobody doing anything about it. But the ideas come from all of those that I work around and have the extreme honor of having worked with for a number of years. So thank you very much, and let's open it up.
Questions? And,
yeah. So do they want to mic the questions? So we're being recorded two different ways here tonight. So I don't know if there's a roving mic or not.
I think we'll just pick up and...
So questions, please, in your loud voice, articulate them, and if I remember, I will try and summarize it quickly. Yes, please. And as people have raised your hands, I think it would be great just a quick introduction of who you are, and if you're with an organization, a half a sentence. And I would really like it if there's a question mark at the end.
I'm Jane Alfireman. We live here in JP for...
Hi, Jane.
Jane Al, and my question is about programs that give families money. And I wonder if you can talk about those. There have been some that you know better than I do, where money is distributed. How does that work? How does it work out?
So do you have a particular one in mind, or?
Is there one that you recommend?
Sure. Sure. So the question is, what do we know about programs that, quote, give people money and what they do about that? There are a lot of different levels to that. There are a number of organizations that offer kind of emergency assistance to folks. But let me really, for this audience, lift one up that is a personal favorite of mine, and that is a program called Family Self-Sufficiency. And let me take a minute or two to tell you how it works. How many people have ever heard of Family Self-Sufficiency before? You guys must work in the social services or housing, right? Yeah, good. Correct me when I go off track here. So, when a family is receiving rental assistance through a number of federal and or state programs, mostly federal programs coming through the state, people pay rent. Virtually nobody lives rent-free. The amount of rent people with subsidized rent pay is calibrated to what their paid income is. The higher the paid income, the more rent you pay. The lower your paid income, the lower your rent is. Family Self-Sufficiency is a program that has thought ingeniously and deeply about what's the disincentive here and how do we remove the disincentive. The disincentive potentially is if you do better at your job, you get more workforce training, you get a second job, you get a promotion, what happens? You get more income. Yes, but your rent also goes up. And it's not a one-for-one, but maybe somewhere along the line there is a somewhat of a rational calculation that goes on. How much of that new job income am I really going to get to keep? All right, so what family self-sufficiency does is if you are enrolled in the program, and this is a big catch, let's put a pin on that and come back to it. If you're enrolled in the program, you sign up and you meet your goals at the end of 5 years. Instead of your rent going up, it's put into an escrow account. Or the calculation's a little convoluted, but for purposes of explaining it, instead of your rent going up, it's put into an account. You meet your goals at the end of 5 years. Every single dollar of that is, in fact, yours, returned to you in a check you can use for any purpose you want, because it's your money. You've earned it in a lot of ways. We've had the pleasure of evaluating the Family Self-Sufficiency Program in the city with the Lynn Housing Authority. And I think within the first couple of months that we were looking at some of the administrative records, a family walked out with an $18,000 check. So this is not little chump change, if you will. They moved themselves out of public housing, and I believe they ended up buying a home, even in the Boston area. Yeah, it was sort of on the outskirts of Lynn. And their daughter, I believe, actually went on to higher education. But that $18,000 check meant a lot to them, and really was that escalator that made those dreams and aspirations much more of a concrete reality for them. Right. Now, that's not the story of every family in the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. It's a program that, for better or worse, in my estimation worse, is tagged to work. Right? The only way you build up money in your escrow is to work and do better, earn more money at your job, or have 2 or 3 jobs. Right? So it's really a work incentive based program in that way. I think that the recent data I looked at, of all of the families in the United States receiving rental assistance or in public housing, about 5% are in family self-sufficiency programs. The scale is really small. And that's largely, I would ding the housing authorities, the state governments who could finance them better, the federal government through the Department of Labor and others in particular, that could also loosen up and make the funding of the administrators of those kinds of programs more robust. It's exactly the kind of program, in my estimation, that can really help families get from a place of poverty or near poverty, which is the only way they could qualify for rental assistance in the first place, to some place that gets them, I don't want to say better, because that's a certain kind of judgment there, but allows them to make more of the decisions by themselves. And just lastly here, I have cavalierly used the expression self-sufficiency, because that's the name of the program. Nobody in the United States is self-sufficient. The only people we demand self-sufficiency of are those in poverty. The rest of us benefit handsomely from things like the mortgage interest deduction, which all the policies around it, by one estimate we're looking at, there is a public investment in the public good, what's deemed to be the public good of home ownership, of about $200 billion a year. Right. Now, it's not literally, but it is symbolically. The federal government writes all of us homeowners a check for the interest that we get to take off of our taxes. Right. The more expensive your home, the more interest you pay, the higher your tax bracket, the more of that subsidizing check you're getting from the federal government of the public investment. $200 billion a year. Right. That is not a small pot of money. Now, if that $200 billion a year were invested in a way that we're really targeted housing security for those families that need housing and are having trouble getting it, for those first-time homeowners. We might think about it as maybe much more effective than it is, but the story is quite different. One estimate is that and listen to this, 86% of that $200 billion every single year, it's not a one-off, it's continuing, 86% of that goes to the top 10% of income filers. It's a huge redistribution of wealth to the top. That's how policy in this instant works. Point of comparison. All right, my housing people can't answer this. How much money do you think we spend as a society on subsidizing rent and housing for people that can't afford it? Somebody? It's about $40 billion a year. Right? About $40 billion for rental assistance or so. Maybe the estimate's a little bigger. $200 billion for home ownership, arguably for families that would be homeowners anyways. Okay. Policy acts in that way. Now, there are other policies like family self-sufficiency that, thankfully go in a different direction, but the scale is much smaller. Is there a question on this side? I want to be. Dr. Ridker.
Yeah, so Paul Richard, ex-JP resident, current political staff over. So you walked into the question I wanted to ask you, Tom, because you said that this problem that led to your toxic inequality started in the 70s. That's being a signal. It's not a Democrat issue, it's not a Republican issue, it's an institutional issue. And you started to talk about the tax code. And I want to push you on this because it sounds to me like that's a huge part of this. So I guess you said question mark. If you could rewrite the tax code, what would you do?
Yes. So if we were to close those doors, we would have a little bit of argument, I would suggest, and we might have to sideline a few obstreperous people. But within 5 minutes, this group would figure out a much more effective portfolio shift in our public investment of $200 billion every single year for housing. And we could do it in a lot of different ways. We could make it flat. We could put a ceiling on it. We could cap it. We could make it refundable. We could make it, we could remove it altogether and just make the standard deduction that much higher so it operates in a flat, much more progressive way. Just off the top, we could do that. What I want to do, and I was in a little bit, I guess I'm in a little bit of an argument with somebody about this over Twitter. There might be four other people subscribing to this little argument. Who thinks that that $200 billion a year should be a saving and we should get rid of it. And not redirect it, but as a saving. And I think that's an absolute wrong framing and messaging of this particular issue. I think it's really important to keep the pot of $200 billion a year defined as a public good for housing and close those doors, and we're going to figure out in 5 minutes a much better way for that $200 billion of public good to be invested for families that really need it, especially for those that need more secure housing, first-time homeowners, people that need to fix their homes up, all kinds of different ways. We know how to do that. The issue here is not the redesign. The issue is the control it's not even in Congress, the control in Treasury and other folks who have access to writing that particular element of the tax code. Paul, the other larger, that's embedded in a larger scheme for me. And that is, if we look at the work of Joe Stiglitz and others who do more direct understanding and writing and analysis of this, the rules of the market, who gets to write these rules, there has been a great transformation that's even more written in a lopsided manner for corporations today than it has been at almost any time that we can recall in our past. And that's reflected, among other things, in rules and regulations around stopping federal agencies from negotiating for pharmaceutical drugs. You know, something that clearly is in the self-interest of everybody except those that write the rules about it. And there are a lot of rules like that, and it's not just the tax code. So that's part of ways of having to think about the kinds of deep changes and transformative changes that we need to get into. Back to this side, yes.
My name is Maria Trevini. I am with Massachusetts Campaign for Single-Payer Healthcare. I believe that guaranteed healthcare, such as Medicare for all, would greatly reduce some of these toxic inequalities. Do you also believe that?
I will get in an argument with some folks here. I think it's the best alternative we have at the current moment. Yes, it would be something I could clearly get behind. I think particularly in terms of those of us that think that affordable care, the retreat on that has been beaten back. I think that we need to sort of throw a little cold water around because I think there has been and will be administrative attacks that undercut part of the ACA, that really undercut the kinds of parts of that we really think are progressive and are much more universal. Yeah, I do. It wouldn't take much pushing at all to get me to single payer. Absolutely. But again, we have to think about the political calculation and why even those apparently who believed in it didn't want to fight for it in the last go around. But I do think it is clearly an alternative that would be protective of the financial assets that families have now. So in the back. Hi.
Hi, my name is Julia, and I'm with an organization called Clinicians for Healthy Families, and we're some clinicians like nurses, midwives, doctors, who work on behalf of our immigrants, specifically undocumented immigrant patient families. And as I have heard more and more of their stories, it motivated me to read up more and more about the big picture and the small picture. So I have a few sentences that will end in a sentence, like in a dot, like a period, and then one that will end in a question. So when I was reading up about why people are fleeing here from Guatemala, it brought me to the year 1954, where the United States instigated an overthrow of the president who wanted to basically help or support the idea that the farmers who had been pushed off land in favor of the United Fruit Company should get some of it back. So he was overthrown, and since then the bloodshed there has been incredible and is now. So families are fleeing now, period. The year 2009, when, same thing, a president wants to raise the minimum wage in Honduras, and our State Department, headed by Hillary Clinton, supports the regime that overthrows him, period. These same, especially fathers, but also mothers, get their wages stolen every day. And by stolen, I mean stolen, not just they're low, I mean not paid. And that happens, especially through the contractor system, or it happens in private households where the babysitter or the elder care person or the cleaning lady doesn't get paid, period. how can we, who are often, hopefully not always, but often on the stealing side of this relationship in one way or another, because, for example, the restaurant worker who, in the kitchen, who we don't even see, is not getting paid, and the restaurant owner might say, well, you know, I've heard this, my girlfriend works for immigration. How do we start opening our eyes to these things that are happening to people right around us, as well as to their family members in these countries that I just mentioned, and start to generate a little bit of solidarity?
Thank you for the question. But more than thank you for the question, thank you for the work that you're doing, and the understanding that you're trying to spread. I really think it's important work, and much more of it needs to be done. Period. I think that the great comments build into the fear of immigration in the United States, which, among other things, has another face to it, and I think we began to hear part of what the other face of that is, and that is both being a need to understand much better what it is that drives people out of their home countries in the first place, and whether it be, you know, the overthrow of the Arbenz elected government in Guatemala or something in Honduras. That's stories that are repeated way too often for political and other refugees, including economic refugees. We need to understand what drives people here, and hopefully what we still represent. We also need to understand the conditions once they get here. And you know, I think wage theft is the tip of the iceberg in a lot of ways. I'm not sure how we want to frame, you know, particular issues around that, but I think moving forward, and this environment obviously is going to be tougher. People often ask me, well, you know, with this guy in the White House, the rules have changed. You know, we used to think government was our friend, and we would lobby government and try and get all these great things done. That's really not quite so possible, is it, these days? There are a lot of rules on the books that are not enforced. And I think, you know, especially around labor standards, is one of those prime areas where enforcing existing rules, we're not asking for, you shouldn't be asking for anything more, just an enforcement of the law. And I will, you know, a Republican congressman yesterday or 2 days ago took, one of the more despicable actions, took a picture of a glass of beer that he was raising in honor of the first dreamer that was deported from the United States. And literally took a picture of a mug of beer and tweeted out, you know, I'm going to raise a glass to enforcement. And when a little controversy started about that, as inevitably it would, somebody pointed out, well, you know, this dreamer had violated 11 rules, 11 laws. Yeah, the dreamer had a license, you know, that they needed to work. And you could run down the list where the system, if you will, of being somewhat undercover in the United States, to be able to get a job, to be able to drive, to be able to get to work. Think of all the laws that we would have to violate if we weren't citizens, to do those very routine, normal functions of everyday life. And yes, we in the restaurants and other in the hotels, we don't see them. They're you know, they're working shifts that we're not awake at. They're cleaning rooms after we've left them. They're washing, you know, dishes in restaurants and things. There are movements around those, and I would just suggest, you know, thinking of supporting restaurant opportunity workers, for example, the various attempts in the Boston area to unionize hospitality workers might be another one. There are active movements on the ground at this moment that those of us concerned about it could be more aware of and more supportive of, period. Ted, a colleague of mine.
Thank you, Tom, for your report in the book and all of your thinking on this. What struck me as you were talking was this area that you call distressed property purchasers.
Distressed assets, yes.
Distressed assets. And the whole history around how various realtors and owners of buildings have targeted people within minority communities, whether it started off in redlining or any kinds of other things. I remember once, years ago when I was younger, and I called up a realtor about a house, and because I don't sound like I'm from African American community, the guy says, "You don't really want to buy in that area." He said, "It's changing, if you get what I mean." That targets and it really tarnishes the opportunity of people like your first family to capitalize on something that should be growing, and other people are benefiting at their distress. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Ted. So, in the spirit of the question, we need to be provocative and sort of call something out that I think is hopefully will make some people a little bit uncomfortable, if not more than a little bit uncomfortable. And what Ted was just referring to is something I brought up already, essentially how housing values are color-coded in the United States. It's what realtors in this wonderful expression that is deeply coded talk about location, location, location. It's demographics, demographics, demographics. What's the composition of the community? Who's going to the schools? That's largely what determines the value when the home could be the exact same home, down to the blades of grass, year it was manufactured, architecture, everything else. We know, we don't have to look very far in Boston, but it's not just Boston. It's every city. It's every county in the United States. And yeah, the dynamics certainly differ. But essentially the dynamic is the following. The more homogeneous white a community is, especially if it's upper middle class, the housing values, that is the wealth it is going to create, and get my air quotes, the wealth it's going to create is a lot greater than if that exact same home were in a diverse community, much less a community that is less than half white. Right? And so it operates that way. The so-called, we are the market that make it operate that way. And they're actors that push us, like your realtor, or the person you talk to, whose institutional financial benefit it is to churn communities like that and to steer folks like that. We have, unfortunately, a very long history of that occurring in real estate markets. The Department of Justice, this one won't, but previous Department of Justice continually writes reports and has consent decrees from trying to stop institutional actors from continuing to redline like this and to continue the persistence of residential segregation, which is really the structure of a lot of the elements that we're talking about. And it's not just the housing values that so-called creates wealth in one community, not as much in the other. It's the quality of the schools. Because of schools are financed by property taxes, it's the only local tax we have in the United States that finances something as important as the public good of education. Just think about that. It's incredible that we do that. So the wealth of the community defines the resources available. I think it's absolutely true, the more money a community has does not necessarily mean it's going to have higher quality education. But everything else being equal, I would much rather have the resources per student at Wellesley than in Lynn. And take our chances from there. Right. and let the individual agency work itself out from there. Now, the provocative part, I think, is my understanding that families that live in those relatively homogeneous white communities are benefiting financially in terms of the wealth generation, in terms of what their schools look like, the first responders, all the public community assets. They are actively benefiting, and they are reaping a comparative advantage. So the benefit, the advantage and disadvantage in this instance are two sides of the same coin. One strategy, when I'm alone, one strategy. One strategy may be, can we figure out ways to remove the rewards from people acting in racialized ways? And once we remove the rewards, a lot less of it's going to happen. It's not going to disappear. But then we'll be able to separate, if you will, the implicit from the explicit racism and discrimination.
How? Give us an example.
So one way you do that is that you don't reward people to move to communities where they buy into higher quality public education.
Wait, so
You remove the reward from doing that. You have states and federal governments step in to more equalize the funding and financial resource pattern there.
So it shouldn't just come from property taxes.
It should,
absolutely.
it should not just property taxes dedicated for an individual community.
Right, right. If it's a school, it's a public
That's
school,
that's
it's
one way.
public
That's one
funding.
way to do that.
Okay.
You know, I'm in many of the interviews we did, and sometimes the language is actually this, where people talk about buying a home in a community because they buy into a better school system. And this is especially when their kids were 5 and 6 years old. It's, you know, those of us raising children in Jamaica Plain, we think about this a lot because our choices are not always the best about whether we move to a suburb, a private school, a test school. The dynamics are pretty complicated about that in our own community, but it's built around the exact same set of dynamics. So what if instead of there was this one great test in high school in Boston, right, that hundreds of kids, you know, miss it by 1 or 2 points, when there's, you know, which doesn't reflect any real difference in what they're going to do in their high school education or their college or their lives. 2, 3, 4, 5 Latins. You know, everybody's fighting to get into this great school. And as a community, we refuse to build more of them. All right, so there are ways around that. Which side? In the back there.
Hey Tom, my name is Miles. I live in JC. I just moved back here from Los Angeles. I'm actually
Welcome.
a writer as well. I'm currently working on a book about young voters, their experiences and how that shapes their political beliefs. But the question I've got for you is about communications after an event like this going forward. You know, all the issues that you've been talking about that are inherent to toxic inequality are issues that a lot of the folks I've talked to for this book and that demographic are keenly aware of. It's been all that they've known growing up and coming of age. And there are two perceptions that I generally hear from folks in that age range about, you know, inequality in general. One is the impetus of, whoa, we got to get out here and do something about this. This is terrible. And the other one is kind of this sorrowful, I know it's so awful, but that's just the way things have been going for decades, and you know, we just have to batten down the hatches and ride this out. And you know, I think that stems either from kind of chronic cynicism or you know, this sort of adherence to the American myth of the self-made person who never, you know, complains or gives up and just toughs it all out for a chance to strike a rich one day. But my question for you is, you know, I'm sure many of us have encountered that latter, more negative sentiment here and there. And what arguments have you found particularly compelling and effective for convincing folks who might be resistant to the idea of change that not only should we work together to organize and address these issues, but that we can do that these issues are tangible and addressable by people like us?
So great. This is exactly the kind of question that we need, you know, the 100 or so heads in this room to get around. And it's exactly where the answer is not just going to come from me. I can talk a little bit about my experience. As a fellow author, and you know, I know Chuck is going to nod his head as well here. We don't write these things to make money. And if we did, we're sorely mistaken. If you ever looked at the hours, whatever. We do it out of passion. We do it out of passion and understanding that books are platforms. And they're platforms that got me in front of you today. All right? They're platforms that I'm really incredibly fortunate in that I'm doing a lot of traveling and speaking around the country to groups like you and groups not like you, and speaking to all, you know, any media that will invite me. So it's a sense of you know, what you can do and help to create a platform for yourself and others like forums like this. I think, I don't want to say I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful, right? And there's a difference. In my experience, I am really lucky because I come in contact with a lot of community-based and grassroots organizations across the country. Sometimes I have the honor of working coalitions with them, sometimes just talking to them, hearing about what they're up to, being in meetings with them. And there is so much going on under the radar of, you know, our so-called media. There's so much activity. It's not probably coordinated as well as you and I would like to see it. There are organizations like Center for Community Change, like the PICO Organizing Network, you know, dozens and dozens across the country, sometimes in national federations, sometimes staying local. I think the closer one gets to the grassroots, the more hopeful I get. If all we were doing is talking to each other, you know, we could keep doing that forever, and not a whole lot would change from that. But it's my sense of being able to talk and learn from that experience across the country, and hopefully be part of the kind of organizational and constituency building that I think is really necessary to push that change forward. So, two more questions. One I know, Tom, and one I don't know. So, oh, I know you. Sorry. So, Tom, who brings great works in the form of books to all of us from his perch at Beacon Books.
So I was going to say my two connections would be Beacon Press and Sportsman's Tennis Club, two that Chuck mentioned before. Tom, these issues seem so big. We have an unfriendly administration. I can think of a million things to do at the federal policy level. Do you see a role for local action? What can a community like this do to detox?
Sure, thank you. Tom, I think that's one of the toughest challenges that people are trying to think through. That is, how do we mediate what's going on locally, and how do we reformulate issues that are of national concern to add value to local efforts, and to do the exact same in reverse as well. You know, I like to put it out in two ways. I think the resistance movement is incredibly important. And I hope that those of us involved in it are not doing it just for our own souls, but doing it for our own souls and with the passion for democracy and democratic institutions long term. But resistance is not enough. Just saying no does not. We need to keep alive a bolder vision of how we can be better in a lot of different ways. And the sort of the phrase I've been glomming onto lately is the phrase visionary opposition. Being able to keep that bold vision alive while trying to stop, you know, the worst forms of the harm that are going to continue coming at us day by day. So I would point to two issues. One is, since I talked about it already, I think something like family self-sufficiency is something that can be and should be much more local. You know, when I asked how many people have heard about it, we didn't know a whole lot as a group. But it could be really important in terms of individual and family mobility. And that happens on the local level. The Massachusetts state government could be really influential in scaling up family self-sufficiency in the state of Massachusetts. The federal government too, but the state can do a lot. And that could take, you know, maybe local pressure could really help that. But at the same time, I also would go to the national issues, the ones that, you know, are really not arm's length to us in this room, and that is the tax code. And that's the kind of transformative reform that's going to need a large constituency to push the 12 people behind a closed door that write that tax code. And so that what we're interested in becomes a part of the larger framework of that, and we don't lose, if you will, the $200 billion every year, but we repurpose it. We do that portfolio shift in our public investment. See how I get around saying redistribute? Last question, yes.
My name is Ward, and I'm retired. And my question is that actually these $200 billion that you talk about, and you want to shift it around. But the problem is that those Medinas that you're talking about, they're voting against their own economic interests. How are you going to do that? I mean, how we could change that with one or two words, rather than this woman was trying to explain the policy of, you know, half hour when he's speaking, and the other guy was doing it in one word.
Yeah, so a good question. Let me answer that by bringing up something entirely different, because I know it's deep in the heart of both Chuck and I, and that's the estate tax. And talk about people actually aren't voting, but thinking about it in what may not be their self-interest. So data I look at, well, let me run the detail quickly here. For a couple that passes away, $10.3 or $4 million is excluded. And then the federal tax rate is 35%. It's 35% not of that 10.3 million, but it's dollar number one after 10.3 million. Right? All right. Now, I think we could survive on that. You know, it needs to be much more progressive in my estimation, and we could talk about that, but that's just... some people have been somewhat successful in trying to relabel the estate tax the death tax. Somewhat successful. 18 out of every 10,000 deaths in the United States each year, 18 out of 10,000 are eligible to pay the estate tax. And we have this huge debate about protecting the ability of those 18 out of 10,000 to pass vast amounts of unearned wealth to their children, grandchildren, whomever, and have the temerity to talk about equal opportunity. You cannot have equal opportunity and large inheritances at the same time, period, full stop. Thank you.